Have you ever felt discouraged by the ups and downs of your prayer life? One week it may feel alive and real, and the next it feels dry and distant. We might assume something's wrong, that we've lost ground somehow, but what if that ebb and flow is part of how prayer matures? Like the ocean tide, prayer rises and recedes, but over time, the waterline of grace keeps moving higher. God is at work in both the sweetness and in the dryness. Hello, friends. I'm Alan Fadling, and you're listening to the Unhurried Living podcast, where we inspire you to rest deeper, live fuller, and lead better. Today, I want to share a few words from a wise spiritual guide from the last century who helps me see how prayer grows, not in a straight line, but with the gentle rhythm of the tide. Some of the best companions in my spiritual journey have been writers who lived long before me. I love to listen to their words, to let their wisdom slow me down and remind me what really matters. One of those voices is Leonard Boase, who wrote a small book called The Prayer of Faith back in 1962, the year after I was born. His reflections on how prayer matures have been a quiet encouragement to me recently, and I'd like to pass a little of that encouragement along to you in this episode. So I wonder, have you ever felt like your prayer life moves 2 steps forward and then 1 step back? Maybe you've had a season or even a few years where prayer felt close and easy, and then somehow suddenly things go quiet. You can't quite find the words to say. You wonder what happened to your earlier closeness with God. If that sounds familiar, take heart. What feels like a loss might actually be growth. One image from Boase's little book, The Prayer of Faith, especially helped me. He writes, "More characteristically of prayer than of any other development is the rule that progress is like the progress of an incoming tide, that each forward movement is followed by a backward one. If on the whole the tide rises along the shore, the predominant impression is one of constant withdrawal after each advance, and the total advance is imperceptible or unperceived." What I think Boase is saying is that spiritual growth, especially growth in prayer, is not linear, doesn't move in clean, measurable increments. It's not a staircase where each step is higher than the last. It's really more like the ocean tide, coming in waves. A wave breaks, and then it recedes. Sometimes the pull backward feels stronger than the push forward. But if you step back and look over time, the tide is still rising. The trouble is we often expect our progress with God to look like progress in other areas of our life. Steady and measurable and controllable. We think, if only I work harder, if I read more, if I pray longer, then I'll keep climbing upward. But grace just doesn't work that way. The spiritual life is less about our management and more about God's movement. It's not something we produce. It's something we receive. That truth reminds me of a story a mentor of mine, Wayne Anderson, loved to tell about his own mentor, Lee Whiston, who was a pastor and a theologian from Massachusetts, who earned his doctorate at Harvard and who cared deeply about both spiritual formation and social justice. Here is part of Lee's testimony that Wayne often shared. He said, "One day, at 40, I heard 6 people tell their stories of how God had changed their lives, honest and transparent. They radiated an inner presence. Soon after this, I was sitting on one of Maine's promontories watching the tide come in. Lee, I seem to hear, you're taking a pail, filling it with water at the point, running to the head of the bay, emptying it, running back to fill the pail again, endlessly running back and forth. Why don't you let me bring in the tide? He says, suddenly I saw the utter foolishness of all my activity. I saw the difference between doing his work and doing his will. I began to open up my life and become more vulnerable. I was amazed at his grace. God, you really love me, and I haven't done anything to deserve it. Growing in grace. There were still relapses, but God was forgiving. I lived more and more of my life from this new center. Isn't that a beautiful story? It captures something essential about prayer and spiritual maturity. We can find ourselves hurrying around with our buckets, trying to fill the bay ourselves. But the tide doesn't need our help. Prayer is not something we make happen, it's something we allow to happen. Like Lee, we can learn to cooperate with the way God brings the tide in, slowly, steadily, sometimes imperceptibly, but always faithfully. Boase also describes another shift that happens as we mature in prayer. He says, in early years, consolation is almost synonymous with emotional sweetness. Later, our taste so changes that we should not care very much for such emotion, even if it were within our reach. He's saying there's a sweetness often to our early experiences of prayer, those moments when God feels especially near and everything about faith feels alive and new. For many of us, those seasons are full of emotion and intensity. But as we grow, that sweetness fades. It can anyway. The thing is, this isn't a problem. It's an invitation. When we're new to prayer, God often meets us in the language we understand, our emotions. But emotional sweetness, while beautiful, isn't meant to last forever. God draws us in with it, but then he gently weans us from it because it's not the deepest nourishment our souls need. I think of it like spiritual baby food. It's good, it's needed, but it's not meant for adulthood. When we mistake emotional intensity for intimacy, we can become discouraged when prayer grows quieter. I think we've lost something. But in truth, God is deepening the relationship. As Boase puts it elsewhere in his book, prayer tends to simplify itself toward awareness of the presence of God. He writes, the growing point of a truly fruitful life of prayer is the emergence into consciousness of a sense of that presence, a taste, a touch. There are no new words for this new thing. The keynote of supernatural prayer has always been recognized as this: an experienced awareness of the presence of the reality of God. That line, the presence of the reality of God, is so rich. Prayer matures from sweetness and striving into stillness and presence. It becomes simpler. We move from talking to God to being with God. It's like sitting in silence with a longtime friend. You don't need to fill the air with words. Just being together is enough. When I think of my own prayer life over the years, I can see that pattern clearly. In my 20s and 30s, I felt prayer most strongly in moments of passion or emotion, music or retreat highs or intense times of ministry. But as the years have gone by, I've found a growing joy in the quiet and undramatic moments of prayer. Sometimes it's just a gentle awareness that I'm not alone. God is here, and that's enough. Maybe you've noticed this in your own journey too. Maybe what once felt like a dryness is actually God inviting you deeper. Maybe what feels like absence is an invitation to presence. The tide is still rising even when the waves seem to recede. So, what if you stopped trying to bring in the tide with your own bucket? What if you let the tide of God's love move at its own rhythm and in its own time? Prayer matures as we surrender our schedules and our expectations, as we learn to trust that God is at work in both the highs and the lows, in both the sweetness and the dryness, in the forward and in the backward. Boase's image helps me remember that the slow work of grace is never wasted. The incoming tide always reaches the shore. And the story of Lee Whiston helps me remember that I don't need to run back and forth trying to make it all happen on my own. I can rest, and I can let God bring in the tide. I'd like to close with a brief prayer. Lord, please teach us to cooperate with however it is you wish to bring in the tide in our own lives. Help us trust your rhythm, the waves of consolation and of desolation, the sweetness and the dryness. When we feel you near, help us receive that gift with gratitude. When you feel far, help us remember the tide is still coming in. Mature our prayer until it becomes simple presence, resting in the reality that you are here. Amen. Thank you for listening to the Unhurried Living podcast. To learn more about us, visit unhurriedliving.com. In the show notes, you'll find helpful links and information about our partner, Life Audio, and all of their other faith-centered podcasts.